Hello, I'm Doug Wentz, and welcome to Make Moderates Matter. In my last video, episode 6, about the November 2025 elections, I noted, among other things, that unfortunately, political violence, or at least violent rhetoric, once again reared its ugly head. A month before the election, the National Review reported that Jay Jones, the Democratic candidate for Attorney General in Virginia, sent text messages in 2022 which suggested that Virginia's then House Speaker, Republican Todd Gilbert, should get, quote, 2 bullets to the head. And another text from Jones even discussed violence against Gilbert's children. As reported by Politico, Jones took responsibility for his actions and apologized to Gilbert and his family. Nevertheless, the question that remained for the November election was whether the voters would feel that Jones's actions were disqualifying. And apparently, they did not. As CBS News reported, Democrat Jay Jones won the Virginia Attorney General's race despite the text message scandal, and it wasn't close. As I noted in my last video, I found this result disturbing and feel that moderates should always, without exception, condemn and not reward political violence and violent rhetoric in all their forms. That was my feeling in a nutshell, but I'd like to say a bit more about this and the broader topic of political violence generally. And yes, now even Republican Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene is calling for an end to violent rhetoric. Let's talk about that and how we can make moderates matter. Welcome back. After Jay Jones handily won his race for Virginia Attorney General, Democratic voters told NBC News that while they strongly objected to the violent text messages, they voted for Jones anyway to give Abigail Spanberger, the Democratic nominee who was elected governor, an ally to help achieve her policy goals. For my part, as I noted in my last video, I found this disturbing, as it would seem to be a victory for partisanship over principles. In my mind, a core value of moderates should be to abhor political violence and violent rhetoric in all their forms. Despite Jones's apology, I personally cannot imagine any justification for wishing violence against a political opponent and their children. And this certainly should apply in particular to anyone aspiring to be the Attorney General, who is charged with being the chief law enforcement officer of a state. Of course, this latest controversy involving Jay Jones is not an isolated incident. Sadly, as Sky News reported, in the last 10 years since Donald Trump first was elected president in 2016, there has been a disturbing rise in political violence in the U.S. involving both sides of the political spectrum. Consider the following. In June of 2017, as reported by the New York Times, Republican Congressman Steve Scalise and 4 others were wounded when a gunman opened fire in Virginia on people training for a charity baseball game. As reported by NPR, in August of 2017, a Unite the Right rally of white nationalists was held in Charlottesville, Virginia, and a woman was killed when a man who was a self-proclaimed neo-Nazi drove his car into a crowd of anti-racist protesters. And in October of 2018, several crude pipe bombs were mailed to high-profile critics of President Trump, including President Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. In October of 2020, as reported by CNN, a plot by members of right-wing militia groups to kidnap Democratic Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer was foiled when 13 were arrested. On January 6th of 2021, the attack on the U.S. Capitol was one of the most notable acts of political violence in American history. Several thousand Trump supporters descended on the Capitol building after a Trump-headlined Stop the Steal rally to protest the certification of President Biden as the winner of the 2020 election. More than 1,200 Americans were criminally charged in the attack, and as Reuters reported, were armed with weapons including tasers, knives, pepper spray, and other makeshift weapons like flagpoles and stolen riot shields that were used to beat police. In addition, at least 5 of the rioters were carrying a firearm, including one man who was arrested with a loaded handgun while dressed in body armor and carrying a gas mask. As reported by NPR, more than 140 police officers sustained injuries in the attack on the Capitol, such as cracked ribs, smashed spinal discs, brain injuries, and a heart attack, and several officers later died. In February of 2022, as noted by PBS News, Louisville Mayor Craig Greenberg, a Democrat, was the target of a shooting attempt at his campaign headquarters, but was uninjured, although a bullet grazed the sweater he was wearing. As noted by Sky News, in June of 2022, a man attempted to assassinate conservative Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh, who was nominated by Trump, at his home in a D.C. suburb. In October of 2022, a man attempting to kidnap then Democratic U.S. Speaker Nancy Pelosi broke into her home and assaulted her husband, Paul Pelosi, with a hammer. And in July of 2024, Donald Trump was shot and grazed in the ear at a campaign rally in Butler, Pennsylvania. As reported by PBS News and the Associated Press, in September of 2024, Trump survived a second assassination attempt while golfing in West Palm Beach, Florida. And in the fall of 2024, the Democratic National Committee office in Arizona was shot up on 3 separate occasions. In October of 2024, just prior to the presidential election, Reuters documented at least 300 cases of political violence since President Trump's supporters stormed the U.S. Capitol on January 6 of 2021, which Reuters described as the biggest and most sustained increase in U.S. political violence since the 1970s. In December of 2024, as reported by NPR, a shooter targeted and killed the CEO of United Healthcare while he was walking from a hotel in broad daylight in New York City. As noted by Sky News, in March of 2025, a blaze at the New Mexico Republican Party headquarters was treated as arson, as incendiary materials were found at the scene. And in April of 2025, Democratic Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro and his family were forced to flee in the middle of the night during Passover after an alleged arsonist set fire to their home in the governor's mansion in Harrisburg. Throughout early 2025, Elon Musk's electric vehicle company Tesla became a target after Trump put Musk in charge of the Doge group that slashed government spending and laid off thousands of federal employees. Cybertrucks and other Tesla vehicles were vandalized, and bullets and Molotov cocktails were aimed at Tesla showrooms. As Sky News noted, in June of 2025, Minnesota Democratic State Representative Melissa Hortman and her husband were shot dead at their home. Another Democratic Minnesota State Senator John Hoffman and his wife also were shot at their home, but survived. And in August of 2025, a man who blamed the COVID-19 vaccine for making him depressed opened fire on the headquarters of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention headquarters in Atlanta. And finally, in September of 2025, as reported by the HuffPost, conservative activist Charlie Kirk was assassinated while conducting an event on a college campus in Utah. But as frightening as were these acts of political violence, just as insidious, or perhaps even more so, were the threats of political violence that were just as detrimental to the American psyche as the violent events themselves. For example, in November and December of 2020, as reported by Reuters, hundreds of threats of violence were aimed at election workers after Trump lost the 2020 election and falsely claimed that the vote was stolen. In February of 2025, the United States Capitol Police reported that threats against members of Congress on both sides of the aisle had increased for the second year in a row. In 2024, the Capitol Police investigated over 9,000 concerning statements and direct threats against members of Congress, including their families and staff. As reported by NPR, threats against federal judges across the U.S. have surged, especially against those overseeing Trump cases, some of whom have been threatened with impeachment and bombs. And in April of 2025, as reported by Politico, Lisa Murkowski, Republican U.S. Senator from Alaska, one of the few centrists left in the Republican Party willing to criticize Trump, described how fear of retaliation by the Trump administration is real and makes Senate Republicans afraid to speak up out of fear of recrimination. And unfortunately, these threats of recrimination against Republicans have an effect. In February of 2024, Republican Congressman Mike Gallagher of Wisconsin announced that he would step down before the end of his term. He later confirmed, as reported by The Guardian, that after he broke with other House Republicans and refused to vote to impeach Secretary of Homeland Security Alejandro Mayorkas, a Democrat, he received death threats and was the victim of a swatting incident targeting his family, which caused him to step back from politics. Gallagher's resignation was particularly disheartening for moderates, as he was a member of the Problem Solvers Caucus, which, as I noted in my first video, is a group of members of Congress evenly split between Republicans and Democrats, whose members sit down together every week to exchange ideas and find common ground. It's truly sad to think that a moderate Republican like Mike, who was attempting to find common ground with the Democrats, was driven from the Congress by threats of violence. So if political violence and threats of political violence are on the rise, what is causing this? It would be nice if we had an easy answer to this question, but it's a complex problem with many causes. One is political polarization. Congress has become increasingly polarized. And in October of 2024, as reported by the Hub at Johns Hopkins University, polling data from the SNF Angora Institute found that nearly half of Americans think members of the opposing party aren't just wrong for politics, they're evil. A second cause of political violence is the role of social media. Social media's ability to amplify hostile rhetoric and disseminate disinformation is a major concern. Algorithms often reward engaging but divisive content, creating echo chambers that intensify partisan hatred and misperceptions about opponents. A third cause is mental illness. Now, it's important to note that the vast majority of people with mental illness are not violent. Nevertheless, as reported by the AP, Robert Pape, a political scientist and director of the Chicago Project on Security and Threats at the University of Chicago, believes that about 40% of those who perpetrate political violence have a mental illness. A fourth cause of political violence is access to firearms, especially assault rifles. As reported in an article in Greater Good magazine, the 20-year-old who took a shot at President Trump in Butler, Pennsylvania, had borrowed his father's semi-automatic AR-15 rifle, which is owned by 5% of Americans and has been used in 10 of the 17 deadliest mass shootings in the United States. A fifth possible cause of political violence is a belief that change is not achievable through normal democratic means, and I'll have more to say about that later in this video. But a sixth possible cause of political violence, and the one that seems to get the most attention, is violent rhetoric, which unfortunately can be traced to politicians of both major political parties. In November of 2023, as reported by The Hill, Democratic Representative Dan Goldman from New York, in referring to Trump, said he was destructive of democracy and had to be, quote, eliminated. Goldman later apologized and clarified that he meant to say that Trump should be defeated in the election. In December of 2023, as reported by Politico, the Biden campaign compared Trump to Hitler. In July of 2024, as reported by Fox News, President Biden told reporters on a private call that the media wasn't doing enough to scrutinize Trump, and it was, quote, time to put Trump in a bullseye. Biden later admitted this comment was a mistake. In October of 2024, as reported by NPR, in the waning days of the presidential election, Kamala Harris called Trump a fascist and a threat to democracy. And in February of 2025, as reported by WTTW News, Democratic Governor of Illinois J.B. Pritzker, during his state budget address, compared the Trump administration's approach to Nazi Germany. Meanwhile, on the Republican side, as reported by CNN, in September of 2020, Republican congressional candidate Marjorie Taylor Greene posted an image of herself holding a gun alongside images of Democratic Representatives Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, and Rashida Tlaib, also known as the Squad, and encouraged folks to go on the, quote, offense against these socialists who want to rip our country apart. In October of 2022, as reported by The Hill, Donald Trump Jr., the eldest son of President Trump, joked about the hammer attack on Paul Pelosi. In April of 2024, as reported by the New York Times, Carrie Lake, the Republican candidate for the U.S. Senate in Arizona, urged her supporters at a rally to arm themselves ahead of the election and to strap on a Glock, referring to a brand of firearm. But the most notable examples of violent rhetoric on the Republican side come from Donald Trump himself. Multiple news outlets such as The Atlantic and NPR have cataloged literally dozens of examples where Trump incited or praised violence against his fellow citizens. Here are just a few examples. In February of 2016, as reported by Politico, during a rally in Iowa, Trump remarked that if you saw someone about to throw a tomato, you should, quote, knock the crap out of them, and he would pay for the legal fees. In September of 2020, during a presidential debate, Trump, referring to the Proud Boys, a far-right extremist group that promotes political violence, told them to, quote, stand back and stand by. Notably, 4 members of the Proud Boys later were convicted of seditious conspiracy in connection with the attack on the U.S. Capitol on January 6th, and the leader of the group was sentenced to 17 years in prison. In March of 2023, at a rally in Waco, Texas, as reported by the Texas Tribune, Trump vowed retribution against his perceived political enemies, declaring that, quote, I am your warrior, I am your justice, and for those who have been wronged and betrayed, I am your retribution. Donald Trump. In November of 2023, despite the complaints by Trump and his associates about Democrats calling him a fascist, Trump said the following during a Veterans Day speech, as shown in a video posted on C-SPAN and reported by ABC News. Today, especially in honor of our great veterans on Veterans Day, we pledge to you that we will root out the communists, Marxists, fascists, and the radical left thugs that live like vermin within the confines of our country, that lie and steal and cheat on elections, and will do anything possible, they'll do anything, whether legally or illegally, to destroy America and to destroy the American dream. The real threat is not from the radical right. The real threat is from the radical left, and is growing every day, every single day. The threat from outside forces is far less sinister, dangerous, and grave than the threat from within. Our threat is from within. Donald Trump. In October of 2024, as reported by NPR, during a Fox News interview, Trump asserted that America was home to sick, radical left lunatics, and he suggested he might use the military against what he described as, again, the enemy from within. In October of 2024, as reported by USA Today, when Nancy Pelosi announced her retirement as the first and only woman to serve as Speaker of the House, Trump called Pelosi evil, sick, and crazy. Also in October of 2024, as shown in a video on C-SPAN and reported by Politico, Trump said the following of former Republican Congresswoman Liz Cheney. She's a radical war hawk. Let's put her with a rifle standing there with 9 barrels shooting at her, okay? Let's see how she feels about it. You know, when the guns are trained on her face. Donald Trump. And in March of 2025, as reported by Politico, Trump gave a speech at the U.S. Justice Department where he labeled his courtroom opponents scum, judges corrupt, and the prosecutors who investigated him deranged. So what are the consequences of all this violent rhetoric? What are the consequences of Democrats calling Donald Trump a fascist and a threat to democracy and comparing him to Hitler? And Trump calling Democrats the enemy, Marxists, communists, radical left thugs, vermin, lunatics, and sick, evil scum who are destroying America? Well, in a nutshell, the constant vilification of our political opponents is a signal that we consider them to be enemies rather than opponents, which can lead to tragic consequences. As noted in an article published by The Hub at Johns Hopkins University, if the people who lead us are using violent or dehumanizing rhetoric, then it's a signal to their supporters that violent rhetoric is acceptable and that violent action might be acceptable. Liliana Mason, Johns Hopkins professor of political science. That's all too true, and it's an all too familiar pattern. Fortunately, however, not all politicians have embraced violent rhetoric, and some have tried to lower the temperature and remind us of who we are as a nation. In the wake of the assassination of Charlie Kirk, for example, Pennsylvania U.S. Senators John Fetterman, a Democrat, and Dave McCormick, a Republican, appeared together on Fox News to make a bipartisan effort to urge civility and condemn dangerous rhetoric. Hakeem Jeffries, the Democratic House Minority Leader, issued a statement that political violence of any kind and against any individual is unacceptable and completely incompatible with American values. And independent U.S. Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont issued a statement that every American, no matter their political point of view, must condemn all forms of political violence. And perhaps the most meaningful words, in my opinion, came from Spencer Cox, the Republican governor of Utah, who, as shown in a C-SPAN video, called out recent acts of violence against both Republicans and Democrats, and noted that we desperately need our country, we desperately need leaders in our country, but more than the leaders, we just need every single person in this country to think about where we are and where we want to be. To ask ourselves, is this it? Is this what 250 years has brought on us? I pray that that's not the case. I pray that those who hated what Charlie Kirk stood for will put down their social media, their pens, and pray for his family, and that all of us will try to find a way to stop hating our fellow Americans. Republican Governor of Utah, Spencer Cox. And wow, now even Marjorie Taylor Greene is calling for civility. Previously one of Donald Trump's most ardent supporters, Greene criticized Trump for refusing to release the Epstein files. And as reported by Forbes, Trump in turn called Greene a ranting lunatic and a traitor. As a result, Greene now says she is receiving threats and is calling for an end to violent rhetoric. In an interview with Dana Bash on CNN over the weekend, Greene noted that being called a traitor by Trump was the kind of language that could radicalize people against her and put her life in danger, and it had to stop. It's frustrating, of course, that it took an incident like this and threats against Greene's own life to change her perspective on the dangers of violent rhetoric, which, as noted earlier, she herself has used on multiple occasions in the past. Nevertheless, Greene apologized and said she was sorry for taking part in the toxic politics which she now says is very bad for our country. She insisted she is trying to change her behavior and, incredibly, specifically hoped that President Trump would do the same. Let us hope as well that Greene's words will be heard in the Oval Office. Suffice it to say that, in my view, we need to hear more such messages. We need to hear the same such words from governors, mayors, members of Congress, and yes, from our own friends and neighbors. Condemning political violence and violent rhetoric is a group effort. The burden is on all of us to choose between conversation and violence. We not only must call for civility, but practice civility. We must show not only by our words, but also our actions that we are all part of one American family. We must condemn political violence and violent rhetoric whenever it occurs, because a community that tolerates violence and violent rhetoric can expect more of the same, which tears families and communities apart and undermines the freedoms upon which America was founded. But how can moderates make a difference when it comes to political violence? In that regard, I first want to repeat what I said at the outset of this video, that in my view, it should be a core value for political moderates to abhor political violence, and by extension, violent rhetoric. And moderates should strive to live that core value by promoting conversation over violence, practicing civility, and resolving our differences through debate, dialogue, and by voting at the ballot box. But moderates can make a difference in other ways as well. I noted earlier that one possible cause of political violence is a belief that change is not achievable through normal democratic means. This subject is explored further in an article by Christopher Williams in The Equation, a publication of the Union of Concerned Scientists, which notes that a combination of perceived grievances, like believing you have been wronged by the government, along with a belief that change is not achievable through normal democratic means like voting, creates the atmosphere for political violence. The article continues by noting, however, that this spiraling of political violence can be reversed when the opportunities to influence government and politics become more plentiful. Or, as Williams concludes, when representative elections exist, society tends to become more peaceful. Christopher Williams. Now, this struck a chord with me because it seems so well aligned with what I'm trying to accomplish with this channel. My overall aim, as I outlined in my first video, is to empower moderation in American politics. I hope to make moderates matter, whether through political parties and organizations or by changing the structure and mechanics of the voting process. And all of this, I hope, as Williams noted, will promote more representative elections so that society may become more peaceful. I'm hoping to provide people of all political persuasions with constructive, nonviolent ways to enable more representative government and achieve change. For example, if the Forward Party or United Kansas actually managed to run a moderate candidate, this would give all voters another option, and hopefully one that, unlike many Democrats and Republicans, is not parroting violent rhetoric. And if a structural reform like ranked choice voting is adopted, moderate voters could vote for their first choice of candidate without fear of acting as a spoiler, because they would know that if their first choice doesn't win, their vote will be counted for their second choice instead. And if proportional representation is adopted that creates multi-member districts, we could completely eliminate gerrymandering and elect representatives in proportion to the vote that each party received in the district. In this system, as I noted in my first video, nearly all voters, including even those in a minority party like a moderate party, would help elect a candidate they support and have their views represented in the district. And if you're a registered independent and live in a state with closed primaries, and the state adopts an open primary system instead, you no longer would be disenfranchised. You could vote in the primary and help to choose a candidate for the general election. All of these measures promote more truly representative elections and would increase the opportunities to effect change, which I'm hopeful should encourage those who might otherwise feel disenfranchised to refrain from political violence. The recent acts of political violence and examples of violent rhetoric that I surveyed in this video reflect the difficult times in which we live, but also present an opportunity. It's an opportunity for political moderates to reflect on who we are as a people, to double down on our efforts to make moderates matter in American politics, and to promote a representative government that fosters a more peaceful political climate. Thanks for watching.